Welcome everyone to CG's webinar, and today we're talking about student agency in changing UK higher education, which is a great topic. We've got with us Gyebi-Ababio and Lauren Bolz. I'll introduce them properly in a moment. Let me first take you through the webinar protocols. Now, remember that the webinar is recorded and winds up on YouTube usually within 24 hours or so. And we're finding that the webinar is being used even more on YouTube than it is in its live format. Now, during the webinar, keep yourself muted unless we're in the Q&A and we've brought you into the discussion. Also, it's a really good idea to turn off your camera, but turn it on again when we bring you into the discussion. We advise you to select speaker view, which is in the top right-hand corner there. Now, during the webinar, the way you join the discussion in the Q&A section is via the chat. You type out your question or a statement if you want to make a statement, and I'll select the people who take part in the Q&A from what's coming up in the chat. And I think the ground rules are if you come in fairly early, if you make a question or a statement towards the end of the speaking time, which is about the first half hour, or just after that, then you're likely to get selected into the discussion. If you come in, late in the piece, you'll probably miss out on the discussion. And when we get to this Q&A stage, I'll give you a warning when I'm going to invite you in. And then you turn on your microphone, the most important part. You turn on your video if you can, and then say who you are and where you are from and ask your question or make your statement. That's all for the webinar protocols. Let me introduce our speakers today. Gyebi-Ababio is the Vice President for Higher Education at the National Union of Students. National Union of Students, for those who are not from UK, a most significant actor in UK higher education. At times, there's been a real influence on events and on policies as they've developed. And one of those student organisations which is always taken seriously in the political space. Hilary was previously undergraduate education officer and chair of the Widening Participation Network at the University of Bristol Student Union. She's a champion of access and equity and of the role of students. With Hilary today, we've got Lauren Bolz, an educational development project officer at the University of Oxford's Centre for Teaching and Learning, where she's focusing on inclusive teaching resources and student staff participation work. And she was previously Vice President for Postgraduate Students in the Oxford Students' Union. And I had the pleasure of teaching and learning with Lauren a couple of years ago in our Oxford MSc in Education. So at this point, let me hand over to our speakers. I'm not sure who wants to start first. Who's going to start first? Lauren.
I believe I'm going first. Yes. Thank you, Simon. So hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, and it should be just some simple slides here. But so, yep, bit of background on me. So I've been a student rep in the UK for quite a while. So I was Vice President for Postgraduates at Oxford Student Union during the pandemic. And I'm currently working as the founding president for a brand new students union within Oxford's newest college. So I have a lot of student rep experience, and I'll kind of be speaking from that experience today, working in Oxford, which is this old research intensive university in England. So the question that has really been kind of guiding this presentation for me is, how can higher education change? There have been big conversations that have been going on about the need for higher education to change for a more equal world. Given the history of higher education, the way that it's come about and been shaped by neoliberal and colonial ideologies, we're now in the situation where universities are really limited in the good they can do for society. And there's big issues in who higher education is really for as well. So, in bringing about this change, I really think that students can play a big part. I think I'm a bit biased being a student rep, but I am going to go through and kind of talk about kind of how students have been and continue to be drivers of small and large scale change, but also a lot of the barriers that they face in that. So how much influence do students really have? This is a question that I asked myself a lot last year during my work in the pandemic. I was constantly just wondering, like, am I really driving change, or am I really just kind of feeding back about change that was really already going to happen, that's already happening in universities? And I do think it's a bit of both, like a bit in between as well. And then of course, there are times outside of that when students really aren't even given the chance to be involved in conversations. So, but I do think that some of the most productive periods of change in universities have occurred and are occurring now because students have taken the need for change really seriously and put these formal and informal pressures on staff and university leaders. We saw this, students have been sending around open letters about their disappointment with the university's efforts to be anti-racist. Students have been going to their professors, starting grassroots movements about how their curriculum is too white. Students have been protesting about the ways their institutions are contributing to climate change and really making it an issue that universities, departments can't ignore. And I think in these situations, students really are driving institutional change. But on the other hand, I think that often these movements for change and individuals' efforts for change take place within such a consumerist framework that is really reducing their student agency. So this is not a comprehensive list, but instead it's kind of the things that I found myself thinking about the most last year. So the first one is we have this kind of student versus expert mentality. So a lot of the times there'll be barriers to student agency because professors or university leaders think that students lack expertise, kind of doing, the hierarchical positioning of students and teachers in higher education. This comes up a lot in conversations about students wanting to change their curricula or their assessments. It comes in about like discussions about tuition fees, lots of things. The next one is what I've called the student feedback paradox. So in England specifically, universities are increasingly existing within the language and regulations of a market. We have tuition fees, student satisfaction, and quality assurance are quite big themes as well. And this focus has caused English universities to place a lot of focus on getting student feedback and collecting data from students on if they're happy and what they think needs to change. And I think this has created a situation where student agency is seemingly high, but it's actually quite limited. So I think some might argue that having the opportunity to give feedback implies agency and this ability to create change. And I think to some extent it definitely does. During the pandemic, I know at Oxford, we had student feedback from these really big surveys that kind of proved students' need for better mental health provisions, and it led to really positive change in that area. But I would also argue that this kind of feedback structure, these feedback mechanisms don't often give students a chance to be fully a part of the debate about the issue and also the resolution of it. So I've had students describe how they think that university and departmental decision-making structures are kind of like black boxes. They'll show up to talk to someone and then tell them that some issue that they want resolved, and then that person will go away. And students don't really know what happens when that happens. But then eventually, maybe the person will come back and hopefully tell them why or why not a version of what they asked for was resolved. And in this sense, feedback doesn't really lead to any agency because students are kind of stuck at this first level of engagement of just complaining. And this of course isn't always the case, but I found that this is, and this can be quite a big barrier to student agency. And this also plays into this third bullet point here about student representatives being kind of framed as adversaries. So I've seen that student reps are often framed as like their job being an obligation to find out what's wrong about the university, convince university leaders that, or whoever, stakeholders that something is wrong and that they need to do something about it. So in this sense, student contributions are framed as these adversarial confrontations or these complaints rather than any kind of opportunity for students and staff to come together and kind of create positive change together. So, instead of engaging critically in decision making and agenda setting from the point of view of the interests of students, student reps and student representation have become they've become about reporting on what students think via these consultative exercises and complaining. And I think this also gets us into this fourth bullet point about the issue of the single student voice or the single student experience. So student voice, the use of the phrase student voice can often be restricted in a way that actually I think reduces students' individual agency. When we run these big surveys or these consultative exercises, then the student data all comes together, and it tends to turn into this distilled version of what students have actually said. It's kind of stripped of their individual contexts, and these diverse student bodies are subsumed into a single student voice or a single student experience. And of course, people are recognizing that students are very different, but it's hard to really unpick that when student representatives are trying to represent the student voice. So in this sense, we're kind of depriving students of agency by only listening to this majority distilled kind of static view of what students want. It doesn't allow for conversations or challenging what students want or anything like that. And when agency is confined to this feedback model, and then it's passed on to student reps in decision-making committees to really report on this, I think agency kind of really stops at this feedback level. Now, I know that we all love talking about the pandemic, so I thought I'd throw in a quick slide to talk about how these structures kind of changed during the pandemic, because structure and agency, of course, are always, changing as structures change. So I think that student agency did actually improve in the pandemic, in the sense that there were greater opportunities for change. There were suddenly conversations happening that just hadn't been happening for decades. And then also there was this sudden need for student expertise. I think the pandemic really made staff realize they don't know much about the student experience, and students don't really understand much about the staff experience either. So students, role as experts in being students really came to the fore. But I think also on the flip side, the importance of this single overall student experience and this focus on quality assurance and making sure that students are kind of getting the value for their money, that became quite important, which really, drove in this kind of consumerist model that stops at feedback. And then we also saw that the government really was treating students as separate from the rest of the population, which just kind of diminished their, ability to feel like they're acting as adults. So given all of that and all those, I guess, barriers that I've recognized, I've asked myself, what would student agency ideally look like? And I think that would kind of be moving towards this partnership model where students are really involved in decision making and all of that good stuff. And I've included a quote here from 3 leading experts in student staff partnerships, where they define student staff partnership as a collaborative reciprocal process through which all participants have the opportunity to contribute equally, although not necessarily in the same ways. So where students and staff are really working together, drawing on their different expertise, and working to come up with a solution and make higher education better for everyone. So, however, I found that this ideal system, there are barriers to it as well. And this has been particularly for me in this new students union that I've been working in, we've been really trying to create this student staff partnership model, but it's been tricky because I think that higher education systems are not really currently designed for this type of student engagement. So I think students really want to be involved in these conversations. I think staff really want students to be involved in these conversations, but students and staff are operating in a system that kind of assumes they'll spend their time in a certain way. It assumes certain roles for students and staff. So when we're asking students to participate in decisions, when the system doesn't really plan for them to have time for that type of engagement, it becomes a really awkward fit. And it becomes the case where students don't have the time, staff don't have the resources to support students. So it really is tricky, because I think that the way that universities are kind of incentivized doesn't encourage student staff partnerships. Universities are currently really, using a lot of economic justifications to prove their worth in society. So they don't really have the ability to leave space for student agency. And then the same thing with students is they're trying to prioritize their own economic success. So it's difficult for them to dedicate time to this as well. So I'm going to just wrap up my bit here by talking about maybe some conversations that I think we need to keep having to hopefully improve student agency and ensure that students are really involved in these conversations. So first is, how do student unions and institutions want to work together? I think this question of, what do we want student representation to look like is really important. I'm not sure I know the answer exactly, but I think that's something that needs to be negotiated between student unions and institutions, because currently, at least in my experience, it does kind of just feel like we're all just kind of figuring it out as we go along. The second is, how can higher education better contribute to the public good? So this, I think, this is a very large question. This is one where I do think that in order for student staff partnerships to really happen, the importance of student agency needs to be a part of kind of wider societal political conversations about the role of higher education in society, stretching beyond the narrow mindset of economic good and really seeing the public good that universities can bring to society, so that universities can be incentivized, or the incentives to only focus on economic measures we can kind of move away from that. And then this third question is, what is the value of student agency, both within higher education and wider society? Throughout this presentation, I have been kind of assuming that student agency is a good thing. And some people might very well disagree with that. But I think that it's really important to keep having these conversations. I think student agency is something that's often kind of ignored. And I would argue that it is a very good thing. I know that a lot of people are talking about how higher education really needs to challenge young people, to challenge the status quo and enact change. Yet we're not really doing that within our own institutions. So which I think is quite ironic, and it's leaving a lot to be desired, I suppose. I think also in the current model, since there are still students who want to be involved and staff who want student views and all of that, where the opportunities for students to use agency become skewed towards those people whom higher education was kind of really originally designed for. So, like neurotypical, white, really well-off students. And so it's only those students whose voices are really being heard, which is quite problematic. So I think that the model we're currently working in really isn't facilitating changing higher education to be open to and designed for all students. So I will end there. So, I've got some references as well, which will be in the slides after. And so now I will pass on to Hilary.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. That was such a fantastic presentation. I feel like I should be like, okay, that's it. Let's all go home. That was great. No, thank you so much. And it's really great to go next from Lauren, because I think you highlighted lots of really important parts of what student agency looks like and how it's continued to evolve and change, and what the relationship looks like on an individual student level, but also on a representation level of students. And I think it's particularly important to be having this discussion now that we're at the end of the third, or at the end of the second full year of dealing with the pandemic, but we're midway through the third academic year of dealing with the pandemic. And so I think there's interesting lessons that have been amplified and have been shown that I'm really excited to talk to you all about. So to give some context, as Vice President of Higher Education at the National Union of Students, I represent students nationally, and that's through working closely with officers like Lauren to get student voices to places of government, sector bodies, and other national arenas where bigger, more widespread change needs to happen. And so I think there's many lessons that we have to learn, and there's many lessons I've been trying to show the sector in the UK, but also in global spaces. And so speaking to you all about student agency and how we in the UK and I'm sure in other parts of the world have changed as a sector is very apt and relevant. And so I'm really open and free with whenever I speak about these things. So please take what you need to take from what I say, but most importantly, please do go back and listen to your students directly, because they will tell you in the bluntest and starkest of ways what agency means to them, and that's really important. So I'm going to have a bit of a focus on the pandemic, but forgive me, it will get wider as I go. So it goes to say that COVID was many things to our society, our world, and our sector. But one of the most significant roles it has played for us is that it has amplified and highlighted the existing state of affairs in higher education. And then in the UK, particularly, we are in a higher education system that needs to be decolonised, decarbonised, and democratised fundamentally from the root of which this higher education system has been built and sustained in some weird way. The current system we have, really bluntly, has forced students to pay things like exorbitant fees to access learning. It's framed them as consumers or customers, instead of co-owners and partners in education. And it has formed a narrative that has developed into a space where students have just become numbers in surveys, league tables, and spreadsheets, rather than people with agency, voice, and choice in an education system that they have been a part of building. The duty of care institutions have had for students and the integrity and quality of education, which we've been hearing lots about over the past year and a half, is directly linked to this. Where we have seen students speak up about feeling robbed of the education they deserve, we have also seen students alongside that plead for flexibility, be that through exams, assessments, teaching, or even extracurricular activities. We have seen this through how students have spoken so passionately about how they didn't want the bare minimum student experience, and one that was copied and pasted from a face-to-face environment to a digital one. We know that crucially, things like digital access to education has been something that students have pushed for a very long time. And so when I talk about COVID amplifying and highlighting already existing issues, a lot of what students have spoken about during the pandemic and the things that we're sort of talking about in the context that we're in now are not new. I grew up, my mom always used to say something to me that she always used to say, there's nothing new under the sun. And I think that's especially the case in higher education now, that all of these issues that we are looking at right now is not new. And so it's really important that when we think about things like digital access, disabled students, students with access needs, students who are parents, carers, or mature students, and even students that commute, have campaigned for things like digital access to lectures and resources for years and years. And during the pandemic, it became very, very clear that providers had to sort of rush to do this for the first time, even though it wasn't new for them to hear that there was a need for this amongst communities within the student body that needed it as a basic need to access their education, alongside students that were needing it for wider reasons. The most importantly, to just have much more flexibility in how they access their education. And I think there's credit to give where credit is due, that, you know, I think there were spaces in universities where the listening had happened, where, you know, academic staff members and colleagues across the sector were really aware of how important it was to implement online teaching and learning, develop digital resource, and deliver lectures, seminars, and exams online. But it was clearly a failure when that was implemented in a way that wasn't necessarily what online teaching and learning would look like in a much more thoughtful way, but instead it was emergency remote teaching and learning. That's essentially what it was, and that's what people have been trying to build off of, rather than actually building a structure of what it looks like to do online teaching and learning in a way that is intentional and not reactive. And so I think it's important to say, as like a key part of this, is that students have spoken quite clearly about how they've yearned for innovation, accessibility, and a plurality in the routes that they can take to learn in higher education. And this hasn't been exclusive to the formal parts of education either. If we look at issues that are plaguing students right now, whether we think about the woeful state of student housing, where last year and in subsequent periods, students have been trapped in lockdowns or have been charged for housing that they haven't been able to live in. We can also look at the fact that mental health has seriously been impacted over the past 2 years and has been a long-term issue that students have spoken about for a very long time. And that's backed up by numerous research, one of which we did, which showed that this time last year, over half of the students that we surveyed here in the UK said that their mental health was worse than it was before the coronavirus pandemic, with loneliness, anxiety, and stress and depression being amongst some of the key experiences that they identified as being behind this. And And when we think about disabled students, for example, again, as well as students who identify as LGBT+, they were also more likely to be vulnerable to experiencing negative mental health during this time. And so it's interesting that there's a link between when students' agency is limited and when student agency becomes much more sort of oversimplified, rather than relying on the plurality of voices that exist in the student body, and what that does for how students are directly impacted in what their wider student experience looks like. And it's interesting that through this, it's important that when we think about agency, I think having agency in its fullness means that we have to stop thinking about doing things from a baseline. And so, students are only able to thrive in environments where their survival isn't the baseline. It shouldn't be the baseline that students should just survive and sort of go from there. It has to be a starting point upon which we build on, and the baseline should be much higher than just survival. And so, as much as none of us were immune to the impact of COVID or the lockdowns that have surrounded it, students were literally left without agency, whether they were physically trapped or alone, with no choice but to accept what they were given and rely on the mercy of government, which in the UK, I can freely say that if and when they decided to act, students really felt at their mercy, and their universities, which had a lot of mixed reviews. And so the student movement and how they responded to what it looked like for student agency to really be revived, experienced this state of being trapped, unheard, and in many cases ignored. And they responded to that with action. And that's why we saw last year there was so many campaigns and actions where essentially students had got to the end of the tether and decided that they had to stand up and make their voices heard in an environment of closed door decisions, limited agency and student voice. And so that's why we saw rent strikes. That's why we saw in some cases occupations and protests, petitions, and many forms of fighting for justice were so commonplace over the period of time that we've just sort of continue to experience as we've experienced this pandemic. And I think what was clear is that when you strip students of their ability to choose and have agency and make the decisions about what's right for them, they can and will stand up for what they deserve and what they want, rather than be placated by circumstances or what is just given to them. Students have now moved to a new place in what it looks like to exercise their agency, what it looks like to demand that they have a better experience of education and a better chance at a future that they are allowed to shape for themselves. Students are calling for a radical rethink of how education is structured and are speaking of the need to strip it back and replace it with a system that truly has them at the heart of it. When students have the power to be partners in higher education, not consumers, the plethora of issues that I mentioned before can and will naturally be resolved. Making education accessible for all should be a top priority for us all in higher education, and that's essentially what students have been fighting for. Things like online lectures, remote access to resources, and other digital provision has significantly improved access to education, and alongside in-person teaching has given students greater choice over how they learn. But for students, this continues to look like offering them a space that can be developed so that they can access their education in new and innovative ways, and in ways that crucially they can thrive in. And so I'll wrap up by starting to say that, you know, as much as I've spoken a lot about the sort of doom and gloom of it, of the fact that there has been lessons that have needed to be learned from a very long time, students have continuously over time in this system felt a loss of agency. There is hope for us to build and actually move forward in a way where student agency is built, adapted to, and students are able to actively be at the heart of what it looks like to shape the education system, their experience of education in a way that doesn't, you know, sort of have a mindset of a means to an end, you know, go into education to get a job, but actually go into education because it is a public good and should be treated as such. And so if we are unwilling to unlock a vision, a new vision of how education could be, and without reacting to the fact that we've become so accustomed to the system that we live in today, agency can truly be unlocked in the realm of education for students. And if we as academics and students together do the work of dreaming and planning a system that is not based on extortionate fees or an inherent imbalance of power, but instead one that values education as a worthy goal in its own right, then that everyone can access, then we can move forward using this pandemic as a catalyst to seize the opportunity and demand an education that is built by and with students as full participants and partners. And so I'll leave you with this. There's a few things that I think are key takeaways in what I've been speaking to you about today. If we are to move forward and reinvigorate higher education, actually fix the fundamental issues at the core, we need to do a few things. I think the first thing is really, really simple, but shouldn't be taken for granted. We have to learn how to listen to students. And this is something that has to be outside of surveying students to death. It has to be outside of doing all of these sort of numerical KPI targeting, as opposed to listening to students in a meaningful way that actually speaks to listening to the change that they need and want, no matter how radical it is, and acting and responding based off of what they said. And I say act and respond rather than reacting, and because I feel that that's where a lot of the failures have existed. I think secondly, we need to give students a space to set the agenda. Often universities, institutions, and the sector set an agenda and expect students to follow that. And I think that needs to be flipped on its head, and students need to be the people setting the agenda as opposed to institutions and governments and people outside of that space. And then finally, it's really important that we let go of the exclusivized and elitist model of decision-making, where students are made to tick boxes and are told to come and help you do the work that you have set out that you want to do, and not necessarily what students want to do. And so we need to let go of that tick box approach to engaging with students and actively giving them the opportunities to maneuver what their education looks like. Education shouldn't be something that's done to students, it must be co-created. And so if we want to unleash the power of our students and solve the issues not only at the center of this crisis of this pandemic, but actually at the center of the issues that we are facing as a world, whether it's the climate crisis or racism or coloniality or harm to people and planet in all the different ways that it exists, we must bring students in centrally into education so we can fight that together. And so I hope that this has really spoken to the fact that, you know, the pandemic has been a real trigger point and an amplification point for the sector and how students have been experiencing a higher education system that has taken away lots of agency. And actually, I think the pandemic has been a big trigger in students being able to wake up to the fact that there is an alternative and there is space to move forward, and in reclaiming that agency and being the people that can shape the education that they are in, that they are experiencing, that they are receiving, in a way that realigns education away from marketization, but actually towards education as a public good for all and not just a privileged few. So I'll leave it there because I could talk forever, but I find it so useful when we do questions and answers. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak again.
Oh, thank you, Hilary. I mean, I think you covered a lot of ground, which a lot of people will agree with what you've said. I've got a couple of things I want to ask both of you, but there's also now an emerging speaking list with some length, which is great to see. My thought is this. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right, Hilary, about the pandemic triggering, revitalization of the role of students, political role of students, and immediately broke out of the shell of the kind of consumerist idea and became a matter of student organizations, students collectively, and the surveys, while they're an adjunct to other things that people are doing, whether from the top or from sideways, they're only just an information system. They're not an actual expression of agency. I mean, you know, to treat surveys of students as a way of expressing student agency is like using opinion polls to run national politics. I mean, it's these sorts of techniques are how elites manage populations. They're not about how bottom-up expression of agency occurs. So a few thoughts about student agency, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. I mean, it seems to me that in political life in these relatively stable political systems in North America and Western Europe, students are the wild card. And maybe this is the case also in many emerging countries as well. In many post-colonial countries, students have been important in a special way as well. That is, they're not a consistent factor in politics. They're not always there politically, but when they are there at times, they've been really transformative. And that's been true right through the modern period. Students are, especially large-scale student populations, have at times made a crucial difference and often have shaped new ideas. I mean, you think of Chile in the last 20 years, they've often put forward new agendas, and in some respects, in some moments in history, have been really transformative in terms of changing the culture, changing the political culture. So you think of the civil rights movement in the US was partly a campus-based movement. I mean, and left a mark everywhere, permanent mark. I mean, I think the second wave of feminism was partly a campus-based movement, and the early ecological movement in the 70s is definitely partly a campus-based movement. Three enormously important transformative movements that came out of student politics, student activism, as much as they came from anywhere. Quite interesting. So students are the wild card. They can sometimes make a huge difference. They're also agents in a fundamental sense in that students are the ones who learn. Students make their own education. They're co-producers of education, always in higher education. And without students being active learners, there's no higher education occurring at all. So in that fundamental sense, students are agents. It's a complicated problem, isn't it? Because their agency is expressed at different levels, teaching and learning activity, institutional governance and policy, national issues, national NUS agendas, especially in education, but sometimes more broadly, often more broadly in some countries. And at the global level, students connecting, think of Europe, Students' League in Europe, very important, but also at times the way student movements, kind of flow through the world. The ideas being raised in one jurisdiction starts to spread everywhere else. Now, so my two kind of questions are these. I mean, how does it become effectively collective? How do you bridge the gap between semi-professional, sort of student organizations and the mass of students? How do you make that? Because it's when everyone gets engaged, or at least many people get engaged, that things really do happen. And the other question is really around the sort of problem that, you'll be very aware of, Hilary, of having to respond to the national agenda, national political agenda set by the tabloids half the time, and the interaction between the tabloids and the Tory party in the UK. I mean, how to get out of that loop and set the long-term agenda, think of the long-term advancement of student agency, but the long-term solution of global problems, which students can lead. How do you kind of stop yourself being totally absorbed, your energy and time being absorbed by this semi-fake national political agenda, but often important too, that you can't ignore, and the longer term, larger transformative role. So that's two things. One is, how to make it collective, how to go from bridge the gap between organizations that the two of you have worked for and the mass of students. And the other one is how to get into the long-term transformative agenda.
Yeah. No, I think those are great questions, and they're regularly questions that I spend nights thinking about very, very deeply. What I would first say to your first question about what it looks like to bridge, from that sort of semi-professional space to the collective, is something actually that I think I've had a bit of a transformation of mind actually when it comes to that recently. And I think if we think about the state of affairs, to think about what it looks like when student agency is done in a semi-professional way. And when I think of that, I think about how student unions have spaces in sort of these professional big decision-making bodies, while students on the ground are sort of also doing their own thing very legitimately. I sort of see the way that it sort of works, especially being in a position where I'm sort of in this semi-professional world where half the time I'm in a board meeting talking about what students need, and half the time I'm on a picket line standing in solidarity with striking staff and students, is that I think there's an organicism that sits in the middle of that, where you can live in a world where two things exist, where on a semi-professional level, you're doing what you can to make a current system survivable for students that know that transformation is needed and are fighting for transformation. And then you can also exist in that space where you are on the ground doing the grassroots campaigns and doing the grassroots work that is bringing the transformation or the transformative system to life. And I think this is important because sometimes I think there's a false dichotomy between the two, where it's like you can either be professional and sit in the meetings and make sure students are okay in the day-to-day, or you can be like on the ground bringing forth the revolution in the starkest of ways. And I found recently that those aren't things that are mutually exclusive. You can be in, and I don't know if Lauren, you want to speak to this in a sec, but you can be in a space where you are legitimately fighting for students to be able to have their basic needs met, whilst recognizing that in those spaces, that is just a temporary measure until there is a fully realized vision that brings a revolution to a system that is fundamentally past its sell-by date. And I think something that really sticks in my mind and has made sense of that to me was, and I'm saying this everywhere now, it's really stuck in my mind. I saw a tweet and it was possibly a quote from somebody. So sorry if I don't give a citation. I literally do not know who said this, but I saw it on Twitter, so I'll legitimize it by that. Someone said, you can't fight a system by sort of like continuing to pick out what is wrong with it. You can't just say that all of these things are wrong and the system will change naturally. The thing that actually contributes to that sort of transformative change is you being able to build a system that renders the current system irrelevant. And I think that's where those two sit. It's, on the grassroots level, the collective are rendering the system irrelevant, whilst the semi-professional sort of level is breaking down that current system and exposing all the flaws that exist in it. And I think that is really important. I don't know if this is a good time to hand over to Lauren to sort of speak to that, and then I can speak to your second question. Do you want to jump in, Lauren?
Yeah, sure. I can just kind of quickly tack on the end. I completely agree that I think it's really important to kind of be doing both sides, both for student reps to be kind of at the top doing that semi-professional work, but also to really be supporting those grassroots movements. I think that institutions tend to kind of forget about that, and they forget about the fact that like students doing these grassroots movements are the ones who are kind of creating these university cultures where other students want to be a part of it, and they're really supporting each other. So I think students unions, et cetera, really should be focusing on supporting those like lower down, I guess, like, movements.
Yeah. And then to speak to your second question, how do you not get sort of swallowed up in what's going on the national agenda? And I'm sure this is the same thing happening to Sabs on the ground. I think when you sort of first enter this environment, it's so easy for people to want you to react to everything. And I like, if I'm being completely honest with you all, the things that sometimes come to us to sort of deal with or speak to or have an opinion on are sometimes just the most bizarre things ever. Sometimes I think the biggest thing that I take from my role is that when I finally finish my term in 6 months in this role, and somebody else who's shiny and newer and has great ideas replaces me, the one thing that I'm really going to value is that I do not need to have an opinion on everything. And I think that's where you are able to find peace in this space. That I think the only way that I've been able to survive without getting sucked into everything is the fact that I've decided that it's not everything that I need to have an opinion on, and it's not everything that is beneficial for me to be able to put energy into. And I think fundamentally what has kept me sort of keeping going on the things that are important is the fact that I know what students need me here for. They need me here to continue to bring those local issues into the bigger framing of the fact that we have a fundamentally broken education system. And ultimately, when I'm in those spaces where people are using diversion tactics to sort of not speak to the fact that a lot of the issues we see in education and in wider society are rooted in the fact that we are still continuing in an environment where the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of racism and continued racism, the legacy of inequality at all levels of society continue to persist. And unless we really go to the root of that and actively look at where that is stemming from, you will get distracted by all of these things going on that don't really speak to the fact that fundamentally, colonial legacies within education, capitalism and how it's been perpetrated in our society and how that continues to reproduce lots of injustices, will continue to take us around in circles instead of attacking those particular issues at the root. And so being radical, I guess, is my short answer. Being radical, addressing things at their root has stopped me from being, what, a year and a half later, has stopped me from being sort of swept up in the winds of governmental distractions and media political playing. Sorry, Lauren, you look like you're itching to say something, are you?
Oh, I can do, yes. Sorry. Yeah, I guess I would also add that I think part of it is kind of fighting back about the mentality of the national agenda that students tend to kind of take on and then not realize they've taken on. So I think, you know, without the belief that you can influence structural changes, students will continue to think that their efforts are completely useless. So it's kind of about changing student mindsets, and of course, changing the national agenda and changing the structures and whatnot will enable students to change their mindsets. But I think changing the student mindsets as well can push back, as we've seen in the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, it's in relation to those really big agendas, you know, like colonialism and its impact, which is so deeply rooted, and capitalism, you know, the notion that the role of the state is to make capitalism work as well as possible for capitalists. I mean, that's the central proposition that the state turns on in the UK. Perhaps not all states are like that. I think the US state is like that, though. It's an Anglo-American thing. I mean, those essential things which frame the political system, only students, I think, have got this capacity to step aside right from that and say no. You know, I mean, others can do it, but students as a group historically have been the most likely to do it. And unless we unpick those binding structural constraints on the political culture, we can't move forward on the big issues, it seems to me. And we're not going to give agency at a grassroots level in a sustained way, because those two premises, colonialism, its hierarchy, and capitalism, the notion that making wealth for a small number of people is the major objective of society. Those two things constrain agency fundamentally. Anyway, let me get into the Q&A. I'm sorry to talk too much. And we'll take our questioners two at a time because we haven't got much time and we've got a few people wanting to come in. So what I'm going to do is invite Kelly Coate and Yushan Shia in first. So Kelly, can you give us a first question, please?
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for these engaging talks and discussion. I think Simon's first question, the way in which you answered it kind of addressed a bit of what I was going to get at in my question, which is very much from an institutional level perspective, in that we run our partnership scheme with students. I'm at the University of Sussex, by paying them out of our access and participation plan budget. So they become employees working alongside of us on a whole range of projects that we've set up. They redesigned Welcome Week, for instance, but we've got them running right across the university, and they're bringing about an amazing culture change where it's seen as just part of what you do when you set up a new project or initiative or curriculum review or whatever. You employ student connectors to work with you. And it's been very successful in that way. But the slight pushback we get is that it's in conflict with the student rep scheme, and that students would rather be a paid connector than a student rep. And that if you're paid, you lack a critical voice. Whereas the student union run student rep scheme is seen by some as offering that space for students to be critical of the institution. And I have some difficulties with this kind of perspective, but I wanted to put it to you and see what your thoughts were about that kind of tension.
Hold your responses. We're going to bring in Yushan Shia at this point as well. Yushan, are you there?
Yeah, thank you very much for talks. I have a question regarding student agency of student and different student groups. I think you mentioned about student agency and also their engagement is predominantly related to the well-off and also white students. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about during your research or work experiences, what are the stories or experiences of student agency of those whose voices were less heard, those socially, economically disadvantaged, and also those students of color, not only at the institutional level, but also how they're tackling the larger social, cultural, and political challenges like social inequality, coloniality, sexism, racism, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Yushan. Terrific question. And let's hand to our speakers at this point. You can choose which of you will answer, of course.
I guess I can come in first. So I feel like your two questions are really like quite intertangled in that, you know, the fact that, so I think it is that students who are well off, they'll have, you know, the capacity to spend their time doing student representation stuff because they don't have to work a part-time job. Or, you know, those students who are, you know, white men, like the people who are typically reflected in higher education governing bodies and whatnot, they'll be the most comfortable stepping into those spaces and, you know, arguing and whatnot in those spaces. So I think one potential solution is kind of, you know, paying students, making sure that students that you're bringing in, like a wide variety of students, and you're paying them, and you're making sure that they're getting, you know, paid obviously for their efforts. And this of course comes into a lot of conversations about race and equality, because the emotional labor that students have to put in to reflect on those issues, I really think it's wrong to ask students to do that without any kind of compensation. Of course, that doesn't solve the issue, but it does make it a bit better. But Kelly, the question you brought up about this conflict between student reps and the paid, you know, student partners is actually something I've been struggling with as well. I've been looking at University of Sussex's student partnership schemes. I think it's quite a good one in my research, and something that, yeah, I've been kind of battling with is what does happen to student representation once you have these paid student roles who are going in. But I don't think that they necessarily replace one another. But I think it does fundamentally kind of change what student reps might do, because they'll no longer be there to give, you know, feedback and just collect student data and like, oh, like, you know, what are students thinking, and then tell, you know, the university, because that might already be happening through the student rep scheme. So in that sense, the student rep should really be there to, possibly in a different role, maybe to sit in these committees and make sure that, you know, changes that are happening are considering students and whatnot. But I think it is something that, you know, needs to be discussed. And I know that's not a good answer, or really an answer at all, but it's, you know, something that I've been struggling with as well.
And to just tack onto that, I'll go the other way. So I'll come to you, Kelly, first. And what I would say is that in terms of what I think the conflict with that is that I think often when universities employ and pay students, which I don't think is a bad thing, I think students should be remunerated when they're doing work for universities, especially in these big crucial areas. And I was one of those students that worked for the university to earn money whilst I was at uni, because I couldn't afford to sort of live off of student finance. I think the interesting part of it comes in when you work with the university and they're paying you, there's a sense that you're working for the university, and therefore you have a responsibility to, you know, do the things that the university would find palatable, would find good, and therefore it sort of comes from that. Again, sorry that I keep speaking about capitalism, but I just see the link so strongly, that sort of capitalist view that if you sort of do what is pleasing to whoever's paying you, then you won't get fired, and hopefully you'll get more opportunities. And so the link there would then link to when you think about student reps, when you're at a student union, and especially student unions at the best of sort of positions where they can be true critical friends, there's a freedom in sort of being as adversarial or as critical towards a university, because there is no vested interest in sort of, other than the block grant, which is a whole different conversation, but there's no vested interest in making the university feel good about the things that you're campaigning on, because you're not relying on them necessarily for them to like give you an income. And I think the last thing that I will say on that is that often one of the biggest places where we see the biggest tensions is that when you work for the university, you have access to the university. When you're in the space of being an activist or working at a student union and engaging with the university, it has been very, very commonplace that when you talk on or act on certain things, a lot of these activists that are unpaid, that don't have the resources, don't always have the access, are shut out as a punishment for sort of rubbing institutions the wrong way. And so that leads to that tension where, you know, there's a clash between remunerating students for doing this good work, but also if you're shutting out the activists telling you the most sort of radical and transformational things, then the tension will naturally arise in that way. Yashan, on your question, I think you make a really, really important point. And I think that was a really great question, because it's exactly what Lauren was saying. When there is a space where you have the resource and the ability to be able to do all of this work, then as somebody of privilege, you'll do it because you can. But often the emotional labor for those that are actively experiencing all of those things means that their ability to do the activism only goes to the length at which they're able to sustain what it's like to both live their their trauma and fight their trauma of the injustices that they are facing. The final thing I will say, to be good for time, is that the difference I always find when it comes to, I'm going to use race as an example because it's quite a good example to show the starkness of it. The way that, you know, when it comes to looking at fighting racism, the way that it sort of manifests itself is that often when it comes to people of color and fighting racism, often it comes from a space of doing it because they need to fight it to survive and live. Like, racism is killing people, quite frankly, and so often people are fighting it because they want to live, they need to be able to survive. But in terms of, like, to be start white people, when they're fighting racism and when they have the privilege to be a part of that action, the reason why they're able to do that often is because it has never been framed to them that racism has also affected them too, for example. And so it feels much more like charity work, and therefore that sort of notion of doing it to survive, doing it to live doesn't weigh as heavily on them because they are not particularly feeling like it affects them directly, and therefore because of that notion of allyship, they're able to do that work more freely because the connection to what it looks like tangibly for them isn't as close. And so that's some of the reasons why you see that divide between those that are experiencing it really struggling and those that aren't experiencing thriving and fighting it, because the dichotomy has been like, it's charity work, you're doing it because you care for people, and so that makes you feel good, and so keep doing it because it's great. And that's a really interesting relationship or environment to navigate. I'll stop speaking there because I know that there's probably more questions and I can speak for days, but hopefully that was helpful.
Oh, that was Hilrith. Vimal Verma, would you like to come in now, please? Vimal? Hello, Vimal.
No, sir. Thank you for the presentation and discussing the student agency. My question is the use of voice by student agency in higher education for personal development or for institutional development. I think it is largely affected by the way a student is financed. And I want to ask, what do you think about it? For example, if I see a student who is taking a technical course and paying a hefty sum for that course, he might be considering education in terms of technical skills and thinking in the term of like developing their personal human capital in the form of technical skill. And what do you think in comparison to if we see a student who is subsidized or who is going taking education in higher education with the help of grant or scholarship, may not behave or use the voice in a similar manner than a student in technical courses. What do you think about that? Just thank you.
And now the second question in this bracket will be from Soman Chattopadhyay. Soman, are you there, please?
Yeah, so thanks, Simon. I should be very brief. I see a great deal of variation in the students' agency in the Indian higher education system. So I'm raising the question, I don't know whether they will be pertinent in the UK context. My first question is that how the office bearers of the students' union are elected, whether there is election or not, because that would determine the representativeness of the student office bearers and their voices. And what I find in India that, it depends also to a large extent on the diversity within the student community in terms of the class and caste, which may not be relevant for UK. The second question is that, in the Indian context, governance structure, which incorporates the role of the student union, to what extent their voices are heard, depends on the funding structure of the university, whether it's a public funded or privately funded institution, right? And this can explain quite a lot. And the third dimension of the student agency is the academic program of the university determines the student agency. The undergraduate, postgraduate, and the research, and there is a great deal of variation, at least in my university. I am from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, on this science students and the students who are in humanities and social sciences. And Bimal is actually working on student agency in the Indian context in my department in JNU. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Simon. And over to our speakers. And this will be the last response. I think we're running toward right at the end of our webinar. So please feel free to make any final comments on the content of the webinar at this point.
Sure. I will go really quickly, and then Lauren, I'll let you have the last word. So what I would say, first of all, on your question, Jamal, in terms of what it looks like for student agency, where students have like sort of subsidies, this is what I understood, right? Subsidies from the university, for example, scholarships, and then what that looks like for students on more technical courses that are there because they're sort of like there to get the skills and skill up in the ways that would aid them in whatever they choose to do further than education. I would say that sometimes there's something quite stifling around when students feel that they are dependent on the people that have given them the access to institutions and higher education, and how that affects their ability to have agency and voice in what they're doing. And I think often when there's this sort of paternalistic view that we gave you this opportunity, you shouldn't sort of ruffle our feathers, it puts students in a weird place where agency is stifled because they are worried that by disrupting or standing up to those that are sort of in the positions of power, they would lose that opportunity to sort of engage with education in the ways that they really want to benefit from. And I think there's something interesting around that. But if I haven't answered your question very briefly correctly, I can drop my email. I can ask Simon or the folks at CG to drop you my email, and I could probably email you something over. In terms of the final questions, I can quickly run through this. In the UK, student union officers are elected by the whole student body. So every year, there's a campus-wide election where students vote for their officers. Often policy and direction is done through student councils, which happen one student council in term one, and then normally an all members meeting in term two. That's sort of the normal flow, but it varies from institution to institution. And then I can't remember your final question, but in terms of final remarks, I will say that, you know, the only way that student agency is really and fully realized is where students are given the space, the resource, and the power to set agendas, to do the transformative work that they are often ahead of the curve in shaping. And so what I would say is that the simplest lesson that I would hope you're all able to take away from this is that student agency is only able to happen when students are given the freedom to speak about and act on the things that they are fighting for in ways that are unconstrained by agendas that are created by people that have not had an awareness of the challenges in the world that students are living in and are trying to move on from, as opposed to sustain because it's comfortable for them. But Lauren, say something greater than I am.
Well, thanks, Hilary. Thank you so much for being in this talk as well. It's amazing stuff I've learned from you. So Famal, on your first question about student voice changing based on how students are kind of like financing their education, I think that really gets into some interesting conversations about students as consumers, because I think that there's building evidence that students are increasingly taking on these like consumer mindsets, that they kind of deserve certain things from the university, that it is more of kind of I paid for this, like what are you going to give me? And I think that does definitely change conversations. But Hilary, what your point about kind of students kind of being afraid of making complaints, I think that is also like a big factor as well. And I think students still see themselves more as students than they do as consumers. So, but it'll be interesting to see, like how that continues on. Then on the second question, so I think just one thing that I want to add to what Hilary said is that I think it's really interesting with student unions usually being financed by universities, because they're being paid to be critical friends, but then there's this weird balance where sometimes sabbatical officers are a bit afraid to be too critical. They don't want to go too far because they might lose their funding. And I know that's something that I definitely struggled with when I was there. Is we wanted to be critical friends, but not too much, and but still wanted, of course, to push forward what students wanted to see. And it was this big struggle. And then I think your last question was on the variation in how students like courses and their all of that changes their agency. And I think one thing that's really interesting about that is kind of with people who are in like more science courses versus humanity courses, that kind of gets into the sciences are typically seen as more economically driven courses, and the government really prefers those and sees those as having a direct connection with employment. And I think that definitely can influence students' mindsets compared to humanities students who maybe feel that they have a bit more fluidity in that, although I would argue that science students also feel they have fluidity in that sense as well. But yeah, that's I'll stop there. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Well, look, thank you both. I mean, it's the nature of this kind of conversation that is never finished, and lots of hairs start running that we don't track down, but by the end of the hour. But hopefully we kickstart further conversations between the people who have been present in this webinar today. And we've had good active participation. We could have run for another half hour, as usually is the case. But thank you both. I mean, I think the issues that you're talking about are as fundamental as any in higher education. I mean, the idea that money creates entitlement, isn't it awful? You know, I mean, this is the sort of framework we're dealing with now. I mean, for all its flaws, the human rights framework, you know, it does, and it's superior to this idea that money buys a right to be heard or money buys agency. I mean, the idea that you're born with agency, that you have an intrinsic right to it by birth as a human being, and everyone has that shared right. I mean, that is a really good core idea that came out of the devastation of the Second World War and is actually worth building on and improving rather than jettisoning, it seems to me, the kind of core human rights idea. The other thing I suppose that I was left with at the end of the webinar was this feeling that something that not talked about much, but knowledge creates agency. You know, knowledge furthers agency. Knowledge provides conditions for or tools for agency. And knowledge is something you get in higher education, and knowledge is something students get in higher education. So that, I think that part of things is really important part of their social contribution. But anyway, look, come back again. Hilary, I hope the next 6 months are really productive for you and wish you well. And Lauren, and we'll hope to see both of you again in our webinar series. You've made a really valuable contribution today. Our next webinar, folks, is going to take us to the thorny domain of human capital theory. And we're going to be talking to the critical human capital theorists, the people who think it hasn't worked correctly as it is, but in another political economy configuration, the idea of investing in human beings might be not all that bad. So there's an interesting challenge for those of us who are out and out critics of human capital theory, but these are very good people. Hugh Lauder, Philip Brown, Xin-Yi Chung, written a really important book on the strange death of human capital theory and how to make it better. And I think that'll be a very stimulating webinar next Tuesday. So look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.